Councillor.
Thank you. So welcome to those in attendance at this remote meeting of the local review body of Aberdeen City Council on the 13th of October. Please note that the meeting will be recorded and published online for public access after the meeting. You're also reminded to note that we may have members of the public and press observing today's proceedings. As Mr. Masson says, the members of the local review body leave their cameras on but mute their microphone when not speaking. As the local review body contains quasi-judicial business, members are reminded that they should not leave the meeting during the consideration of any of the reviews. So this meeting has been convened in response to the review of the decision taken by the appointed officer under the Council scheme of delegation, following the decision taken by the local review body at the meeting on the Monday 9th of October. Members had the opportunity to undertake a site visit earlier on this morning. Members also have before them copies of the review documents listed in the notice calling the meeting. I will now ask Mr. Masson, the Assistant Clerk, to outline the procedure to be followed in the conduct of these reviews, and will take a roll call of all members present.
Thank you. So members have the procedure note which was circulated with the meeting papers and is intended to set out the wider framework within which the review process operates. From this, it is clear that the first task for the review body is to come to a decision on whether the review documents contain sufficient information for the case to be determined without further procedure, and by that it's meant without further information or representations. To assist, I feel it would be helpful to mention the following. Firstly, that the regulations governing the local review process require that all matters which the applicant intends to raise in the review must be set out in or accompanying the notice of review. Secondly, that the focus of the review should be on the basis of what was before the appointed officer when a decision was made, and only in exceptional circumstances will new or additional matters be permitted to be taken into account. Thirdly, to note that the modernisation of the planning system, which included revisal of the planning appeals process, of which this local review body is part, removed the previous right on the part of an applicant to insist on a hearing and replaced that with a local review body, providing them with the power to choose a procedure which more accurately reflects the facts and circumstances of the individual case. And lastly, that guidance issued by the Scottish Government's Chief Planner in 2011 stated that reviews by local review bodies should be conducted by means of full consideration of the application afresh. This review should take the form of a structured discussion led by the chairperson to consider the matter set out in the notice of review before you, and I would conclude by drawing your attention in particular to points 10 to 12 of the procedure note. Thank you.
Thank you. So with all members being present, we'll now turn to the consideration of the review in respect to the decision to refuse the application for the change of use from public open space to private gated communal garden and erection of associated enclosure fence with gate. This is retrospective at land to the rear of 6 Craigden, Aberdeen, AB 156YW, planning reference 221307. We will now hear from the planning advisor in attendance, Ms. Lucy Green, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I point out that Ms. Green attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance because she has not been involved in the early consideration of the application under review. Ms. Green will not, however, be able to ask to express any view in the merits of the proposed development, and in effect her role will be neutral, one involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. I'll now hand over to Ms. Green.
Thank you, convener. I'll just put the presentation up. Okay, so this is the review into the change of use at 6 Craigden, as you've already noted, and we've carried out the site visit. So I was just intending to go through the slides that we looked at before, but quite quickly, and then move on to the policies that apply to this case. So obviously that's the site plan of the area that we visited this morning. It's 780 meters squared. And that's the overhead aerial photograph, which was taken, looks as if it was taken last year or earlier this year. I'll just move past these quite quickly. And that again just shows the line of the fence as we saw along the edge of the viaduct and along the south end of the site. And obviously that's the gate in the south end as well. Elevations of the fences that we saw, and photographs from the viaduct from the applicant's statement. So just a reminder of the reasons for refusal and points made in the report of handling. So the main point being the loss of public open space, which was originally required as part of the earlier planning application for the housing, that it affects the character and amenity of the surrounding area, that it prevents access for recreation on general access rights and rights of way, and therefore reduces access and recreation value of the green space network. That it's contrary to the enhanced access that's part of the local development plan and the national planning framework in terms of health and well-being, and that it would set a precedent for the potential for other spaces to be fenced as well. And overall, that could result in a gradual erosion of open space. Contrary to design policies and policies on green infrastructure, green space network and residential areas, which I'll go into in a later slide, raises the issue of the Land Reform Act, which allows access to space in general. Points out that many locals wouldn't have access to the space and that historic crime is not a material consideration. Moving on to the summary of the applicant's case, notes, as we saw, that it would be accessible to all residents within Craigden with a combination lock on the gate. Notes the travellers' encampment on adjacent land, which was by the owner of that land with caravans. It refers to permission granted for allotments on land to the north, not the application site, but on the other side of Craigden, and points out that the back garden is quite exposed to the viaduct and experienced littering. Points out that trees were planted previously and were vandalised, and also that people congregated under the bridge, that there was tree removal by the previous owner of the land, and that the fencing and maintaining the area has transformed it. The applicant points out that the objectors don't stay in the local area, that the open space audit raises the need for better quality and accessible space, with requirements being flexible, and that is well provided for in the Hazelhead area. It points out the age of the open space strategy and the audit and queries whether that should be a reason for refusal. And again, points out the appeal on the allotment site, where the reporter found that the loss of green space was minor with enough remaining in the area. Further points made by the applicant, that the site could be considered forestry and wouldn't constitute development requiring planning permission, that it's held in separate ownership to the house and is not part of the garden, that there's sufficient amenity space provided within the area, that the fence matches other garden fences and isn't detrimental to amenity, that allowing trees to established will improve amenity, that the area is not valued open space, it was brambly and rubbish filled, that this would result in a private gated communal garden, which is a form of open space, and that there's therefore no loss, that the proposal would allow delivery of nature restoration and biodiversity in support of policies, that no core paths are impacted, that in terms of precedent, each case should be decided on merit, and that this area has its own issues and benefits from the proposal. Also that the fence requires permission due to the proximity of the road, but that the road is 20 metres above the site and has no relationship with it. It further refers to passive surveillance and states that's a reference to passive surveillance being mentioned in the report of handling, and states that it's not referred to in policy 14 in NPF 4 and shouldn't be a reason for a refusal. That the area is not council owned and that cameras would not stop vandalism, and that the applicant would accept a temporary approval with conditions for the fence to be removed when the trees are mature. So moving on to the relevant policies. NPF 4 consists of national policies and forms part of the development plan. And these are the relevant policies in this case. And policies 1, 2, and 3 on tackling climate and nature crisis, mitigation and biodiversity are sort of overarching policies that are relevant to every application. Policy 15 on local living seeks to provide for the needs of residents within the locality, and that this would provide open space for residents. Policy 14, design, and is similar to policies in the local development plan and the proposed plan. It seeks to have access to green space for health and active life. And then policy 20 states that development proposals that result in fragmentation or net loss of existing blue and green infrastructure will only be supported where the proposal will not result in or exacerbate a deficit in green infrastructure provision, and the overall integrity of the network will be maintained. So if we move on to policies in the local development plan, the site's zoned within the residential area. So it's open space within a residential area. So policy NE2, I will move on to that on a separate slide. Trees and woodland, that policy seeks to protect trees and woodland, and similarly policy NE3 on natural heritage seeks to protect natural heritage in the area. And then there's planning guidance on open space and green infrastructure, which refers to the green space, the open space audit and strategy, and also the planning advice note, which advises on defining types of open space and incorporating them into development. So really the key policies for consideration are policy H1 on residential areas, and then policy NE2 on green and blue infrastructure. So looking at the policy for residential areas, it says that within these areas, proposals for new residential and householder development will be approved in principle if, and then there's various criteria, one of which is they don't result in the loss of open space. I mean, obviously it's not strictly a proposal for new residential and householder development, but it does relate to use by residents. So this criteria is relevant, but is actually also covered in the policy on green space. So loss of open space is the relevant consideration. And then the second part of the policy, so within existing residential areas, proposals for non-residential use, this refers to no conflict with or nuisance to the enjoyment of existing residential amenity. So that would be the relevant criteria there. So if we just move on to policy NE2, which relates to open space. The site's part of the green space network. So this part of the policy is relevant. I've just pulled out sections of it on this slide. So the policy seeks to protect and enhance the green space network. And the purposes of the green space network are in terms of wildlife access, biodiversity, the services and functions of the ecosystem, access, recreation, landscape, and townscape value. So development that doesn't protect, support and enhance the green space network won't be supported according to that part of the policy. Urban green space is also relevant, and this doesn't just cover those areas zoned as urban green space, but also includes all other areas of smaller spaces, not specifically identified. So similarly to the green space network, the policy seeks to protect, support and enhance urban green space, and development proposals that do not achieve that won't be supported. Outdoor access and core paths. Well, we've seen that it's not, that this site doesn't affect a core path, but it does mention other paths and rights of way across land and safeguarding access opportunities to those. And then the final part, in exceptional circumstances, routes may be affected by development. And then it talks about how maintaining amenity value and finding alternative paths if there are routes across land affected by a proposal. So also the Aberdeen Planning Guidance on Open Space and Green Infrastructure supports this policy and provides guidance on how developments will be expected to assess and demonstrate their compliance with the policy with regards to delivery of open space and green infrastructure. It's usually more relevant to new residential developments and providing green space for them. So evaluation of the application should be on the basis of the development plan, so the policies we've just looked at, and the Planning Act requires all applications to be determined in accordance with those policies unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And just a reminder that all applications should be treated on merit. So the basis for this decision would be, do the proposals comply with policy H1 for residential areas? And that notes valued open space and also the impact on the character and amenity of the area. And then in terms of policy NE2, how would the proposal impact on access and the wider network of open space? So overall, does the proposal comply with the development plan as a whole, or other material considerations that would weigh for or against the proposal? And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Any questions? Not seeing any indication of questions at the moment. Councillor MacDonald.
Thank you, convener. Can I have a question around timings of the various policy, particularly NPF 4, which came into effect in February, and the local development plan. There was also made mention in the report something about the supplementary guidance not being relevant, and I just wanted to clear that up in my own head about what it is we're making a decision on in terms of policies.
Yes, at the time that the report of handling was written, it was considered on the basis of the National Planning Framework, and at that time the adopted plan was the 2017 plan, and the policies in the proposed plan were taken into account, but the basis for the decision for the LRB would be on the basis of the now adopted 2023 plan. So those policies would be relevant. In terms of the Aberdeen planning guidance, that remains of limited weight as it hasn't gone through the full council process yet. So it is of relevant, but of lesser weight.
Thank you very much. Can I just check with you, convener, is there another section for questions on the the detail of anything, or is this the only opportunity?
Yeah, so I think this is the only, looking through the details here, this is the only opportunity for questions at the moment. And before we go into the termination, the only other part was if we felt that we had sufficient information in terms of where we were at the previous meeting, which we've now concluded that we've had the site visits. We're now sort of in the questions of the policies and things like that now.
Thank you for that. Can I then ask whether, and I wasn't clear from some of the written documentation, has an application been received to change use from open space to a private gated communal garden at all?
Yes, that's this application. It's for the change of use from public open space to private gated communal garden. So that's
there's not an application to have a change of use to a garden, is what I'm trying to establish.
That's right. There's no application for change of use to residential garden.
Okay. And I suppose the other thing that I was reading through was there seemed to be a bit of a lag between, well, there was the pre-application advice request, which didn't seem to materialise, but there seemed to be a bit of a lag between some of the letters that were received at the beginning of this year and then the determination in June. And I just wondered if that, I mean, it might not be material and there might be very good reason for it, but it was just to clear that up in my own head.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that, to be honest. There aren't any amendments. It may have been that we were waiting for more information, but I can't answer that, I'm afraid.
There was also mention about temporary approval in the report from the applicant, but it didn't give any indication of how long temporary might be, so to let the trees grow and so on. Was that considered by planning people?
Well, that seems to have come in the LRB submissions. I had in mind I'd seen 5 years actually, but obviously if members were minded to put a condition on it, could be any length of time. No, the case officer doesn't cover that in their report.
Yeah, so I did wonder if that was a kind of new aspect that had come into being. So and no, I just suppose the other thing, having been on the site visit, there was no roads were not concerned in any way about the application, and I'm assuming that any access that was needed to maintain the viaduct would be fine. But I just wanted in my own head to understand that the road we walked out of up to the viaduct, is that where cars had, vehicles had come down, is that open to anyone to go up and down there in a vehicle?
If you mean the vehicle tracks in the mud,
yes.
that seemed to be blocked off by large stones now. So
okay. I didn't notice
that
the
would
stones.
prevent just at the edge of the NHS car park.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, okay. That was good for me. Thank you. That's all my questions, convener.
Thank you. Any further questions from members? Okay, so in accordance with the procedure note circulated, the LRB will now discuss and decide the manner in which the review is to proceed. I would highlight that all representations relating to the case have been considered and taken into account. So, determination. What's people's thoughts at the moment? Councillor Thacker.
I think at this stage I would maybe be minded for approval with a time condition in regards to the maturing of the young trees. But happy to hear what others' views are.
Okay. Councillor MacDonald?
Yeah, I'm minded to uphold the officer's recommendation unless persuaded otherwise, because apologies for that, I'll just ignore it, because I do think that under our policies of particularly H1 residential and I think also on the green and blue infrastructure, that I am concerned about the lack of open space for everyone, and I'm just not sure that this complies with H1, and definitely for me it does affect the character and amenity, but to what extent, I guess, and I think that's where the debate comes, with Councillor Farquhar mentioning maybe a temporary, and it grows into its own skin. I have to say, I wasn't blown away by the reference to this was a really well preserved site, and was a real gem. And oh no, what wasn't, I can't remember the phrase that was used in one of the bits I read about it being a good site, because it wasn't, it didn't look particularly loved and cared for, and would have been better, in my view, to be part of that wider open space network. So that's where I am at the moment, convener, unless persuaded otherwise.
Yeah, I'm sort of similarly minded at the moment in terms of H1. There is a loss of open space in terms of the amenity into the wider area as well. So it is what is there improving versus what there was before? That's a bit of struggling here. Yes, it may be slight, or maybe more kept to what it was in terms of bramble and brush before, but that's a bit I'm struggling with at the moment. And certainly in terms of NE2, in terms of enhancing biodiversity, has it? I'm not overly convinced that it has. We've had a fairly well established, I would say, biodiversity. It is technically scrubland and bramble and brush and things like that, but the biodiversity within that then versus now, I'm not overly convinced of that point as well. And in terms of core path, I understand that there wasn't a core path there. It still doesn't affect any core path, but still it's a public right of way in that regards. I know with the Scottish policies around access to public land and things like that, is this gated? If I was to walk past that, to me, is that open space or is that an extension of somebody's garden? Because to me, that looked like an extension of somebody's garden. It was a gated off area. So that's where I'm weighing up options there at the moment. Councillor Radley.
I sort of agree with everything, which is which is a problem. I am concerned. I agree with Councillor MacDonald. I'm concerned by the lack of or the loss of open space. I am also swayed by Councillor Farquhar's argument around the trees. It's really difficult to manage that if it's not gated. However, I am concerned by the precedent this sets as well. I think it has wider consequences to how we do planning applications going forward, and I agree with yourself, Councillor Convener, around the gated. It doesn't look like an accessible open space that everyone can use, and that is what it should be. So I'm sure. I'm on the fence. I do understand Councillor Farquhar's arguments around the trees, because that is, they are young trees. However, I think I'm probably leaning more towards Councillor MacDonald and Councillor McCrae's argument at the moment.
Yeah. It's not an easy one. I do understand the point of does the fence help to allow the trees to regrow into that area again, but there is other areas of the city. I know we're only dealing by a case on this, but does do other young trees require fencing in order for it to grow? And I do believe that, you know, in other areas, and I know we're dealing with this as a case-by-case basis, but the optics of this, and if we do allow this to happen, do other communities or private landowners or come back and say, well, you know, I want to protect my land, therefore I'll put a fence around it, and that could potentially block off ways and rights of access to other green spaces around the city and around our networks. So yeah, it's very, very difficult. I'm really struggling to see where this fits into NPF4 and our own LDP in terms of this application. So at that point, I'm probably minded to uphold the officer's recommendations or refusal on this at this time, but I'm happy to take further discussion on this.
Yeah, I take the point about setting a precedent, and there are other considerations around, you know, Land Reform Act and so on. I do wonder as well about the, you know, the biodiversity, because it did seem to me that space was different when we went out of it into the area around the burn and so on, and was quite striking, I thought, in the species that were in there, and maybe as a result of maybe not having the deer that we know munch around. But again, I take on board, you know, the small trees, although the trees are actually quite big now, the ones that have been planted. But there are ways to protect trees that are growing from deer, and there are ways to combat vandalism and, you know, and crime and so on. And I just think, on balance, that fence shouldn't be there, and so I think with the application we've got in front of us and all the considerations, particularly diversity and loss of open space, and I would be minded to uphold the refusal of the application.
Councillor Thacker, do you want to come back in on that or any points?
I've not got really anything new to say. I do appreciate all of those viewpoints, and I definitely can see both sides for sure.
Okay, are we happy to go to determination or do it? Yeah, any further discussion? Okay, therefore we'll move on to determination. So as I've previously just noted, I don't feel that this complies with H1 and NE2 within the LDP and NPF4. So at this point, I would be minded to uphold the officer's recommendation for refusal at this point. And I'll just go around the room. Councillor MacDonald.
I would recommend refusal as well.
Councillor Thacker.
I think I would recommend approval with a time limit of 5 years. But yeah.
Okay, Councillor Radley.
I'm going to go with refusal at this time. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. The local review body has therefore agreed to, by majority, uphold the decision of the appointed officer, and the application is therefore refused. Please note that decision notice from today's meeting will be issued to the applicant or agent in the forthcoming days. Thank you very much for all of your time and for the site visit this morning. Thank you very much. That concludes the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.